Welcome, creative adventurers. I'm Debbie Cohn with Cone Designs. Thank you for joining me today. It's week 7 of the It's Christmas Time Quilt Along. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Then head on over to my blog where you can download all of the PDFs, the free PDFs for the blocks in the Quilt Along. But please do it by November 30th. After that, I'll be transforming the individual PDFs into one pattern, and it will be for sale after December 1st. So let's get started on sewing. This week's block will be the house block. It's the last block and the last row of our quilt along. I hope you enjoy it. Let's get started. So here are the blocks so far laid out on a quick instant design wall. Just some batting pinned up to my cabinets in my kitchen. There's row 1, the presents row, like this. And then the second week was the trees row, and I had offset the trees, upper and lower. The third week was the stars block, and I chose the traditional sawtooth star with a simple center. You can see I fussy cut some of them, just a little bit. Then the next week was the stocking blocks. I've got a pin in one where I need to fix the block slightly. This is likely not the final layout, but it's pretty close. I've tried to balance the rows and the blocks for color and contrast. The next week was the ornaments block, and again I've offset this row as well, upper and lower, opposite from the trees, to give a little bit of movement to the quilt, like that. And then this week's block will go through at the end. Before we get started sewing the block, I want to give you a quick overview of the block. As you know, it's a house block. It's divided into two basic parts. The top section, of course, is the roof section, and these are half square triangles. I'll show you how to cut and to trim those in several easy ways. And then the bottom section is the walls, the top, and then the door. And then there are background side pieces to make sure that we don't cut off points when we're sewing the blocks together. So it's pretty simple and quick. You'll notice I don't have it in the gray flannel. This is a test block, but I ran out of the gray flannel background, so I'm just making do, and this is the test block for this week. Also, if you're choosing to use directional fabric, I'll give you some hints on how to cut these pieces out so that they'll be going the correct direction. For preparing the fabric, I want to give you a couple of tips. As I mentioned, the roof section here is 5-inch squares, which measure down slightly smaller than that. For cutting these fabrics up here, you could use leftover fabric from the presents block, I believe, has extra, and the ornaments blocks for sure. You could use the other half that you didn't use making those blocks. You'll have plenty of fabric for those. Or you could even use more uncut squares if you'd prefer. For this section here, you will have to cut into new squares because none of the leftovers are quite tall enough for using for these sections. That being said, here's what I've got left after making my house blocks. I've made them all. I still have 7 full squares left, and then I've got 3 more almost full squares. I've decided I'm going to use these along with my scraps. I'm going to go ahead and use these scraps to make a scrappy binding for my quilt. I'll cut these all down into strips and then go ahead and piece them together for a scrappy binding. I think it's going to look great. If you have a strong directional print like this one, what you'll want to do is recut the 10-inch square if you need to so that it's straight. This particular one, I put the pieces back together. You can kind of still see there's some waviness and wobbliness when it was printed by the manufacturer. So I had to go through and cut off sections of it and square it so that the print itself was square, even though the original square is off slightly. That way, when I cut my pieces, they will actually be square pieces and the direction will not be wavy. Another thing I suggest, in addition to squaring up your 10-inch squares if they're printed not quite straight by the manufacturer, is when you cut your walls like this, when you cut your walls, that you cut them going across the 10-inch square to keep the pieces lined up. So what I mean is, let's say you're going to use this, you're going to cut your fabrics in this order: wall, top of door, and wall. That way it'll flow nicely when you sew it back together. Another thing to consider when you're choosing your fabrics for your house blocks is looking for a strong contrast between the door and the walls and the roof. Now that's my personal preference. You may want them to be, maybe you want your roof and your walls to be the same fabric and then a contrasting door. It's totally up to you, but it will look good visually if you look for contrast amongst them. And what you can do is just use the same 5 fabrics, let's say, for each of the blocks, and then swap amongst them so you have a different roof, or maybe the walls are different but the same roof. It's totally up to you to customize this block the way that you want. Let's move on to cutting the fabric. The first thing you'll want to do is to cut your print pieces for the roof. That will be fabric A. You want to cut out the square. When I was actually making these, I stacked up all my prints that I've chose for the roof pieces, and then I just cut out 5-inch squares out of them by stacking them and cut once, and I'm done. Let's move on to fabric B. As you can see, I've cut my fabric.
Here's a photo of the 4 sets of print fabrics for 4 of the house blocks. I began to stitch the door upper section and the door itself together when I took this photo.
Were not cut straight. Squared off the fabric pieces that were not printed straight by the manufacturer, and then I cut my pieces in an assembly line style. There's my fabric B, which is the walls. Then I will need to move on to the top that goes above the door. That's fabric C. Again, I did this assembly line style as well. Remember that I cut fabric B, then C, and then B again, so that if I had directional print, that would flow across when I sewed it together nicely. If you don't have directional fabric, you can cut them in any way that you want. Again, when you're stacking the squares, choose the layer number of fabrics that works best for you. I chose to do all 5 at once, but you could certainly just do 1 or 2 at a time. The last one we'll want to choose for our print fabrics is to cut out our fabric D. Consult your pattern for the exact size, but basically you'll definitely want a strong contrast between your walls and your door. That will really bring life to your block. Now we're going to cut our background fabrics. Here's my background fabric. I've pressed it a quick press, and now I'm going to just make a clean edge. Then I can measure over and cut my fabric E piece. I'm going to give this other side a quick straight edge as well, just to be totally accurate on this, making sure. It really helps with the final result. There's our fabric E square that we'll need. That will be used for our half square triangles for the roof. Now I'm going to cut the fabric F, which is the roof sides. There's our fabric F, set that aside. And the last thing we need from our background is our fabric G. Here I'm cutting down my fabric G. I will need 2, so I'm going to help myself by folding this in half, cutting a straight edge, a clean edge, and then cutting what I need. And here is our fabric G. That's all we need for our background fabrics. Let's get sewing. The first thing we need to do before we can actually make the roof is to create our half square triangles. To do that, we have our fabric A and our fabric E. Together, these half square triangles will make the roof for our house. I want to first draw a line on the back of fabric E on the diagonal. There's a couple ways to do this. One way is that I like to do is to line it up, the diagonal corners on the mat, and then take my ruler like that, and then draw the line with a pencil line. But you will actually be sewing a 1/4 inch on each side of the drawn line. So you can either make 3 lines, the center, and then 1 on each side, a 1/4 inch from the center, or you can just draw the sewing lines, the stitching lines. To do that, you could line up your 1/4 inch in on the diagonal of the squares and then draw a pencil mark like that, and then repeat on the other side. That's one way to do it. Then you don't have to draw 3 lines, you only draw 2. You can also do this assembly line style like I showed in a previous video. You line up your squares one after the other and use your longer ruler, and if necessary turn the mat and then line them up and mark them all at once. I did find another handy tool that I had in my stash I'd forgotten about, which is this. It's called Medium Seam Marker by Missouri Star. I got this when I visited there this summer, and this works really well as well. What you do is, if you happen to have this, is you line up the ruler in the corners, the diagonally across, and then you just mark on each side. It makes it quick and easy. Like this, underhanded there, and there you go. It makes it quick and easy. But you don't have to have the specialty ruler. You do not. You can certainly just do like I did and mark them using your longer ruler and the mat. Once we do that, then we can go ahead and sew. We're going to put them right sides together like this. And you can pin if you'd like, maybe a pin here and a pin here. And then you're going to sew right on these lines, which is a 1/4 inch from the center. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so I have my fabric E and my fabric A right sides together. I've drawn my lines and I'm going to stitch about a needle's width just to the left of the drawn line. That will account for fold over when we press the seam back on our half square triangles. I'm going to flip it around and then sew down the other side again, sewing just a needle's width to the left of the drawn line, this way, to the inside. As you can see right here, I've sewn just to the inside of the drawn line. As you can see, I ran out of bobbin thread, so I'm going to have to resew that one section. But you know, that happens, so I'll just finish it and I'll get right back to you. Okay, as you can see, I replaced my bobbin thread and I finished stitching. Now it's time to cut this in half to create our half square triangles and then press them back. You can use a shears or you can use your rotary cutter. You can just eyeball it. It just needs to be generally halfway in between, so about a 1/4 inch. For me, I'm going to just use my shears. There we go. Now let's take it to the iron and press them back. Before we press our half square triangles, I wanted to go over 3 different options for squaring them up. And the reason I'm doing this now is because one of those options requires that you do the cutting before you press your triangles open. So one option is to use the Clearly Perfect slotted trimmer, which works well. The way that you do it is you don't iron first. What you do instead is this. Let me move this over so you can see it. And these are going to be 4.5 inch. So you lay your dash line on the desired cut size on the seam of the unpressed. And unpressed is key here, HST, and then you trim it. So mine's going to be 4.5. So I lay it like this, the dotted line, 4.5. I lay that on my seam line, which is the stitching right there. And I slide it over so I have about an equal amount showing. There isn't much to trim, honestly, right in here. And then I would take my rotary cutter and trim around here, and then I would trim in this slot down here and this slot up here. That automatically cuts off your dog ears or the leftover bits of the triangles. That's one way to do it. It's fast and accurate, but not everybody has this specialty trimmer. Another option will be to use the OmniGrid ruler. Now this is a ruler that I happen to have that's 4.5 inches square, so that makes it pretty easy. Once my HST is ironed flat, which it's not yet, but it would be, you just lay it on there and then center it so you have about an equal amount all the way around, and then you take your rotary cutter and you trim it. The trick to that, of course, is lining up the diagonal line on your seam, which is right here. And this is the one I'm going to use. But let me show you another one, because you may not have this specialty ruler either. I'll demonstrate that in just a moment. Now it's time to press our half square triangles. This is if we're going to use either the OmniGrid version, where we cut around all 4 sides, or we use the mat and ruler and a straight edge ruler to just cut around them. I'm going to want to press my triangles. So I do that by just pressing gently, flattening out the seams, and then I'm going to press the seams open to reduce the bulk. To do that, I'm going to get it started by gently using my fingers to nudge the seams a little bit flatter and give the iron a place to start with. So using my fingers, gently opening it out like that, give the iron a spot, and then pressing down. Once it's opened, then I might give it a shot of steam and then flip it over gently, very gently, and then it's pressed open. Do the same thing with this one. Again, I'm pressing the seams open to reduce the bulk in what will be our roof sections. We will be joining them together, these half square triangles together, and I want to keep the seam bulk to a minimum. Nudging the seam open with my fingernail, like that. And then a shot of steam, gently, not swishing or pushing, gently nudging, like that. Now we're going to trim. I'm going to show you 2 of the ways that I do it. As I mentioned, I happen to have this OmniGrid ruler, 4.5 inches. It's the exact size I'm going to need to trim my half square triangle. So what I'm going to do is, there is a diagonal line here. I'm going to line that up on the seam of my half square triangle, like that. Making sure it's lined up on both ends, and then sliding it down, adjusting it slightly, so the amount I need to trim is pretty even from one side to the other. Then I'm going to trim with my rotary cutter. You could put this on a rotating mat so you don't have to pick it up and turn it. If you had it on a rotating mat, you would just turn the mat instead of the square. Line it up again, because that eliminates you having to stop and start, and then trim again. You do have to press pretty firmly down to keep the ruler from sliding. So that's the one way. Now, if you don't have the specialty rulers, no problem. You can just do it the old-fashioned way. It works just as well. And what I do is I try to center the block. what I do is I try to line up the block so I know it's 4.5 inches, and I can see that it's going to be over just a little bit right here, about 1/8 of an inch. So instead of trimming it off on one side, that might make it uneven. I'm going to scoot it over just a little so the difference is about the same on this side and on this side. It's about 1/16 of an inch or so, and I'm making sure it's reasonably straight across here. Then I'm going to take my ruler and I'm trimming to the 4.5 inch mark on my mat, like that. Flip it around. I'm lining up this edge with the inch mark right there, and now I'm going to the 4.5 inch, or 4.5 inches over, I should say, and then cutting this side. Now I have two sides that are square, so to cut the other sides I just simply line up the squared off edges, the cut edges right there that I know are straight, and I look again the same way. This one's just barely maybe 1/16 or 1/8 inch over, so I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to split the difference, making sure it's lined up and even up here, and then I'm going to trim, and there isn't much to trim, I will say that. Just a slight bit here. And then I do the same on the other side, again lining it up, going over 4.5 inches and giving it a trim. There we go, not much to trim. All right, there's our half square triangle. So now we're ready to, I've got both of them, now we're ready to sew them together to make our roof. So the way you're going to do that, of course, is you can see this is the peak of the roof right here, and we're going to sew them right sides together with a 1/4 inch seam like this, and then we're going to sew down this side, and when we open it out we'll have the roof section. What I suggest you do as well is once you've sewn this seam, then take your fabric F pieces, and sew one to each side. You could of course do that first, it's really up to you. You're going to sew one to each side, and then we'll trim the unit, the whole roof unit down as well. And then it will be ready to attach to the bottom half of the block. Now I'm going to go ahead and stitch my half square triangles together, 1/4 inch seam. Next I'm going to attach my fabric F rectangles on each side of the roof as the roof background sections, as the roof sides. Don't worry if this is a little long, you'll be able to trim it off, not a problem. I am going to pin for this because they're kind of on the thin side. Just a couple of them to make sure I've got it stable. And then sew. Okay, now we're ready to press the seams, and our roof section is done. Here you can see our roof unit. What we're going to do is press this middle seam open, and then these seams we will press away from the center of the block. Let's do that now. So I'm going to nudge this open a little bit with my finger as well, just to help get it started a little bit. If one of your other seams moves, just give it a quick press. Okay, once I'm sure that'll lie flat, then I'm going to press it from the other side gently. Now I'm pressing this seam and this seam, And now I'm going to press it away from the center of the block, giving it a nudge gently with my iron. Then a little steam. The same on this side. Gently nudging it with my iron. And then I check the other side. It's looking very good. And we're ready to trim it, so consult your pattern for the exact measurements to square up the unit, the roof unit, and then we're ready to move on to making the walls and the door. You can see I've got my test block on my design board. The section we've already done is this entire roof section up here. Now we're doing the door section. That's the door and the top of the walls that go over the door. We'll sew those two together, right sides together, 1/4 inch seam, and then we will attach both of the walls, the side walls, to the door section. Last but not least, we will attach the background sides for the block, and then we'll be able to sew both sections together and be done. Let's go ahead and sew the door section. Here are my fabric C and my fabric D. I'm going to put them right sides together with a 1/4 inch seam and then sew the pieces together. Then I'm going to go ahead and add on the side walls right here to each side. Let's go ahead and do it. Before you sew your door unit, one thing you might want to just double check is that you have your directional fabrics going the correct way if you're using them. So this is my part above the door and this is the door itself. So when I put them right sides together, I want to make sure I have my door straight so it's not upside down, and the same with the wall section. So here I'm just going to put them right sides together and do one quick pin and then go ahead and stitch. I'm going to just finger press this section. I'm going to press it open. Just with my fingers, just give it a quick press, no need to go to the iron. Then I'm going to stitch on the side walls. That's our fabric F on each side. Again, making sure if you've got a directional print that you've got your directions correct. So I want my houses to go right side up like this. And then I just lay it down and sew. You may want to sew from this side to make sure that the seam is laying flat, but I'm going to do it by feel. So it's whatever works best for you is fine. And I'm going to sew on the other side. Again, I'm checking to make sure I have my directional fabric going the correct direction. Right sides together. Now that I've checked the size of my fabric G's and made sure I have the correct dimensions, I'm going to stitch them one to each side of the walls. Flip it around and stitch the other side. When I'm lining them up to make sure they're even at the top section here, rather than the bottom section, because we will be trimming across the bottom of the house block. So you don't have to worry about that so much. Okay, there's the bottom half of our block. That's the walls, the door, and the background. It's time to press, and then we can attach the two halves together. Okay, here's the bottom of our block, and we'll need to press the seams. What we're going to do is press these middle seams away from the center of the block to reduce the bulk at these corners here. But these seams here, where the background sides are, we're going to press toward the house this way. So let's go ahead and do that. You'll notice that we had finger pressed this one seam already. So now we're going to just go ahead and gently press this one. You might need to give just a gentle tug there and a gentle tug to help nudge it down. And then a shot of steam. We want to press those toward the center. Before we do that, I'm just going to give this one more quick press
And on this side, there we go. And then we're going to press this toward the inside like that. So I use the edge of my iron to gently nudge it in place, and the same on this side. Very gently. Let's see how it's looking on the back side. Right here it needs a little help. Let's do that. All right, and then check the front one more time. It's looking good. So I give it a quick press of steam. And then you're going to want to trim the wall section of the block to the sizes in the dimensions in your pattern. And that's why we have a little extra here. We're going to trim off the doorway and trim this section, and then we'll be ready to attach the roof. Here you can see I'm just trimming this ever so slightly on both sides. I will make the final adjustments when I square up the entire block, but just giving it a trim to the more or less the correct dimensions, and then we'll get it exactly squared up when we do the final squaring of the block itself. All right, now we're ready to attach the roof to the walls, the roof to the walls. And we'll do that by putting them right sides together. The one thing you'll want to do though is to mark the center of your door, and then you're going to match up the seam of the roof with the center of the wall, the wall section right here, when you put them right sides together like that. That will ensure that your roof section is centered on the block itself. I found it easiest to mark it on the back of the door like this. So what I do is I look at the distance between the two seams from here to here. It's just barely under 2 inches. So I make sure there's the same amount on the seam here as here. And then I take a pencil and I mark it right in between like that, this tiny pencil mark. And then I'm going to match it with the seam right there. That seam, I'm going to match it to that pencil mark like that. So we'll go this way, matching it up, looking on the back side, and then I will pin. And then we'll go ahead and sew right sides together, 1/4 inch seam, and that should complete the block. All that's left to do is to square it up. You can see that I've made sure to pin the center section right there where I've matched them, and then a couple more pins toward the beginning. Then I'm going to sew and adjust as I go. All right, all that's left to do is to press our seam and our block is done. Now it's time to press the last seam of the block. For this seam that joins the roof and the walls, I'm actually going to press it so it goes this direction, away from the roof. The reason for that is to try to alleviate some of the bulk in this section here. I'm going to nudge it with my iron, and this one tends to be a little bit challenging, this particular seam. So you may want to really just gently tug on it a little, even finger press to get it to lay down like it needs to. Check the back side, and you can see it didn't get where it needed to go, so I'm going to give it another press. Okay, fix that. And then look at the front. There, that looks awesome. And there's our block. One quick tip about the house block. When you go to square up the final block, I suggest that you do most of your trimming, if it needs squaring up, to square it from this side. You want to leave as much as possible up here in the corner so that when you sew the sashing on it, it won't cut off the peak of your roof if possible. So again, if you have extra to trim off, trim from the bottom. Try to leave as much as possible up here at the peak. That will ensure that your piecing shows up well. One last tip on squaring up your house block. When you are squaring it from left to right, what I suggest is that you line up the peak, the center of your roof, on your mat line, and then you're going to measure over 4 1/4 inches and then trim down, and the same on the side, 4 1/4 inches over and trim down, because the blocks square to 9 1/2. That will be the easiest and quickest method for squaring up your block. So you can see here that I made a mistake, and I want to explain to you how I'm going to fix it. Sometimes things happen and you're not paying attention, like I wasn't, and I didn't double check the dimensions on my pattern. I mistakenly said you cut 4 1/4 inches over. It's actually 4 3/4 inches over. So I cut this side of the house block too short. So all I'm going to do is get my trusty seam ripper, I call Jack the Ripper, and I'm going to pull off this piece here, and then I'm going to pull off this piece here, recut the 2 pieces that I need, and sew them back on. I don't have to rip apart the whole block. I'll just probably seam rip this seam right here, just back just enough to be able to sew this piece on, and then that one, it won't be an issue either, just to add that other piece. And then I'll sew them back together, stitch this seam, and then I'll recut to 4.75 from the roof center over to square up the block from left to right. Sometimes mistakes happen, but we can fix them. Here you can see I've performed the necessary surgery and fixed my block. So now it's all done. You'll just need to make 4 more blocks, 4 more house blocks for the entire row. Here is the row of this week's house blocks. Again, you can see that I've fussy cut a little bit, but not a lot. I tried to match the directional fabrics, or at least get them reasonably close. One of the things I like about the house block is that in the fabric line there were little barns, which I felt looked like houses, so I was sure to use those for the house block. And there you have it. The blocks are completed. Next week we'll go over the sashing and the binding and the borders for the entire quilt. Just a sneak peek for those who are interested about the sashing and the borders and the binding is that for the sashing between the blocks, I will use jelly roll width 2.5 inch strips of the same background. No cornerstones, nothing, just put a 2.5 inch strip, the height of each block in between every block, between block 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 3 and 4, and 4 and 5. And then we're going to put a row of sashing between each row. So one long jelly roll width strip, 2.5 inches, between each row. So between rows 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 3 and 4, 4 and 5, and 5 and 6. Then around the border, I'm just going to again use a simple jelly roll strip all the way around on the borders, on the sides, 2.5 inch wide by the height of the quilt. And then once those are attached, I'll add 2.5 inch strip of border across the top and across the bottom. The binding, as I mentioned earlier, will be scrappy, made from the scraps left from my squares. So that's just a quick sneak peek to those who want to know and want to get a head start on it. You certainly can. It's just simple, straight sashing, 2.5 inch strips of plain background. Nothing fancy at all. Easy enough, certainly for beginners to do. But I will go over it in detail in our video next week. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. And that was this week's house block.
I'm so glad you joined me today. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed sewing. Go ahead and give this video, please, a big thumbs up and subscribe to my YouTube channel and tell a friend. Head on over to my blog to download this week's PDF of the house block pattern, and then as well to download all the other patterns. Please be sure you do that before December 1st, because after that the patterns will be consolidated and go into one single pattern, which I'll put for sale on my website. I hope you enjoyed this. Please join me next week for our final week of the Quilt Along, where I will explain how to add the sashing and the borders and the binding for the quilt. Thank you again. I'll see you next week.